Hello YouTube and welcome back to another sensor spotlight. Today we're going to be looking at the collision sensor. So again, a reminder, if you haven't seen the Always Sensor Spotlight, go and check that out because we're going to be basing this tutorial off of that one. Also, you can skip to any part of this tutorial at any time by clicking any of the menu selections in the annotations at the top of the video. Okay, so one quick note before we get into the sensor itself is that one of these objects must be a dynamic object, unless of course one of them is a sensor, and the sensor would have to be the one that you're using the collision sensor on. So for instance, the collision sensor will not work if our two objects are both static. One of these has to be dynamic, rigid body. I'm not sure about soft body actually. A sensor, or a character. So for this, I'm just going to choose a rigid body so that whenever we play the game, we see the cube falls down. Okay, so here's an example of where you might want to use a collision sensor. We have a really basic platformer here. This cube is our player, here is the platform, and here we've got a plane, which is lava. So in the physics tab, we have actor selected for the plane. And our cube is a rigid body. On the lava plane, we have a game property, and it's called lava. And on our cube player, we have a keyboard sensor that's wired straight into a motion sensor. So whenever we play the game, we can move the player forward. Then we can use a collision sensor with the property selected lava to determine when our player has hit the lava or collided with the lava. And currently what we're doing is restarting the scene. So if we play the game, we move our player off the edge, he hits the lava, and he respawns. Now of course you can make this do all sorts of things, like you could have it restart the scene, you could have it go to a new scene, or you could have it quit the game with a game actuator. Okay, so that's just one of the many situations you might want to use a collision sensor, so let's move on. Okay, so here we are looking at the collision sensor, and like I said, if you haven't seen the Always Sensor tutorial, go and check that out, because here we see we have all of the same buttons as the Always Sensor, and just a few extra ones here across the bottom. So the most important of these is the field here, which is either going to be property or material based on this selector here. So with property selected, we are going to type in a game property that we want the sensor to look for. So what the sensor is then going to do is it's only going to go positive if it detects a collision with an object that has this particular property on it. So for instance, if I had some spikes and this was my player object here, I might put in the property name spike. Well, that means that on my spike object, I need to add a game property and name it spike. The capitalization does matter, so the spelling and capitalization both have to be exactly the same, otherwise it will not work. So if we choose material, we actually get a selection where we can actually choose one of the many materials that we have in our blend file. Now one thing I've noticed for myself, I don't know if this is the same with everyone, but whenever I choose the material mode, the sensor acts unpredictably. Sometimes it triggers, sometimes it doesn't, and I haven't been able to really figure out why that is. It's possibly a bug, but I'm not sure. But in most cases, using the property selection will be just fine. And then on the far left, we have pulse mode. Now what this does is if you have multiple objects colliding with this object, what would normally happen is, if you have one object collide with this object, the sensor would trigger the controller, and then if a second object hits, while the first object is still colliding with this one, the sensor would not re-trigger this controller. So you would only get one pulse or one controller trigger, even though two objects collided with this one. With pulse mode turned on, if the first object collides, the sensor will trigger the controller, and then whenever the second object collides, it will trigger the controller again. And then if the first object stops colliding with this object, it will trigger the controller yet again. The tooltip explains this okay. a change to the set of colliding objects generates a pulse or triggers the controller. And that is what it does. So now let's move on into Python to see what some of the attributes are you might want to use with the collision sensor. Okay, so here we are inside of Python, and of course we get the sensor the same way as we get all of the other sensors. And again, if you haven't seen the Always Sensor Spotlight, it is all of these standard sensor attributes in that tutorial, so this one is going to be focused on just the attributes that are special to the collision sensor. So, as we can see, the collision sensor has many more unique attributes compared to the actuator sensor. We can see we have 3 configuration attributes. Again, these are just like pushing the buttons on the actual sensor. And again, configuration attributes can be set or can be read from. So instead of setting these variables, we could also read from them. So the first one we have for the collision sensor is prop name, and this actually doubles as material name as well. So we see that it takes or returns a string, which is the property name that it should be looking for, or the name of the material that the collision sensor should be looking for. So in our example, we are using spike. Next we have use material, and this is telling the sensor whether it should use the material detection or the property detection. So you can see we set it to false, which means it's going to use a property. Next we have use pulse collision, and this is the same as pushing that little pulse button, and we are setting that equal to true, which means it is going to use the pulse collision. Next we have the status attributes. We can see the first one is hit object. This will only give you the first object in the list of objects that has triggered this sensor. Next we have hit object list, and this is the same as the hit object attribute, except instead of only returning one object that has triggered the sensor, hit object list will return the full list of objects that have triggered this sensor. So if you have multiple objects that collide with this object, hit object list will return all of those objects, whereas hit object will only return one. Okay, so that is a basic overview of the collision sensor and some of the attributes that you might want to use for it in Python. Next time, we're going to be looking at the delay sensor. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and help you out. Just leave them in the comments section down below. If you'd like more info on this sensor and any of the other sensors that I'm going to be covering in this tutorial series, there is a link in the description below for that. If you have a suggestion for a future tutorial, there is also a link in the description for that. So, like I said, next time we're going to be looking at the delay sensor, but until then, thank you all very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.